That works perfectly.
But if we go over, we've got a half hour for break. We don't need a full half hour. Well, I had them bring one just in case.
Just in case. Wise indeed.
Yeah, well, because Gloria had said she was bringing a flash drive, so I didn't know.
Right, yeah.
I didn't know if she had a laptop, so I had IT bring one just in case, but.
No, we appreciate it. I thought, in fact, when I got on the plane, I'd left the computer at home. Thankfully, I just put it in the wrong slot, right? So,
Laptop in case she doesn't have one. So yeah, if we don't need that one, we can take it away.
great. Oh, I just got to check the.
I asked Paul to set it up, so yeah, he has a feel to it, so I actually don't know. But Dave's gonna introduce the lecture, and then John's gonna introduce the speakers. Yeah, Dave's
Oh, is this the? This is for sound. What do you need? Is this for sound?
Yes.
Let me see now. I hope this will work. All right, we'll find out in a minute.
Is this your computer?
Yeah, I'm just checking to make sure that video plays.
Oh, yeah.
So I slid some waters up here,
Okay.
so there's plenty. If you need more, let me know. Got more?
So is it?
Yeah, I'll send it to you right now.
As standing in sexual victim.
Oh my gosh! Oh, that mercy. Look who the cat dragged in. How you doing?
Oh,
Who's that?
yeah. I'm just here. You guys still look the same.
Wow. Oh, is that so?
Yes.
That's amazing. Wow.
I'm so glad that you guys are here.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
absolutely. No problem. Let me see here.
You're good. From time to time. Not all the time.
Okay.
I'm pretty much more like New Jersey.
Okay.
Hopefully next time I'll let you know next time.
Please do. Please.
Just to.
It's great to see.
I know.
And to know this has been a good fit.
Yeah. Okay. So, but I'll bring water just in case you guys might need something. Still got Tabasco sauce? Pastor John? Tabasco sauce. You still have some hot sauce in the oven?
Oh, yeah, but Tabasco's just light.
Okay, I'm gonna get some water for you. Right back.
Okay, go ahead and play it one more time for me.
All right. Where were we? Let me see. Here we go.
I stand.
I stand.
I stand against sexual victimization.
Sexual victimization is non-consensual sexual contact that happens from one person to another person.
This is a subject I think that our church has been concerned with.
I stand.
I stand.
I stand against sexual victimization.
Sexual victimization is non-consensual sexual contact that happens from one person to another person.
This is a subject I think that our church has been concerned with, committed to, working through for a very, very long time. It's an issue in our family. It's something my wife experienced.
I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, so I certainly know the impact that it's had on my life. And for me, it was almost 60 years ago, and I can say that I'm still kind of dealing with the residue of that.
It often happens early in a person's life, and the consequences can be devastating for them, for the people around them. I think it has, in many cases, multi-generational impact.
Sexual victimization is a scourge that affects all of us.
We know that from statistics that it really is impossible to have a congregation of people where no one has this experience, and yet we're really not talking about it.
And the darkness in the world doesn't go away just because you walk into a church. It's extremely important for us to talk about it, otherwise it's swept under the rug.
I think that you can't really say it's a woman's issue or a man's issue or a children's issue, because it really is everybody, and it could be anybody.
I think the church really doesn't know the amount, the number of people who might have gone through something like this, who have a story to tell.
The act of violence, it is, becomes the epicenter of an earthquake of other actions and reactions. And so there's just great sense that what happens to one happens to us all.
I'm also a survivor of sexual assault, so I wanted to be here to empower other women and also to empower myself.
Courage is needed in order to shatter the silence. Courage is needed to
That worked. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to North Park Theological Seminary, to the Isaacson Chapel, and to the A.E. Palmquist Lecture series in preaching and pastoral ministry. We're delighted that you could join us this evening. The Palmquist name is quite storied in Covenant ECC history, Evangelical Covenant, and North Park history. The lecture series is named for Aaron Eldon Palmquist, who was pastor here in Central Conference superintendent, and a storied, well-known preacher, loved the church, loved the school, loved education. His father, Aaron, you got to pay attention now, Aaron Ewald Palmquist, was in the first graduating class from the seminary here in 1894. And then the great-grandson, great-nephew, Aaron Palmquist, was our director of admissions in the mid-2000s. So there'll be a quiz if you're paying attention. But the Palmquist Lecture Series is to highlight pastoral ministry, preaching, and the intersection in society and culture of those disciplines. And the lecture series itself began in 1987, and listen to the list of folks who've lectured here at this series. The Reverend Dr. William Williman, the Reverend Dr. James Forbes, the Reverend Dr. James Earl Massey, Reverend Dr. Don M. Wardlaw, Reverend Dr. Jennifer B. Brooks, and our most recent in 2014, Reverend Dr. Nancy Lamars Gross. And so we are delighted that you've chosen to be part of this tradition, to join in and listen deeply and think deeply about preaching, about public ministry, about the importance of the pastoral arts. So welcome. Dr. Soong-Chan Rao is going to introduce our speakers of the evening.
It is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for this evening for the Palmquist Lectures. I think pretty much every year that I have been at North Park, I've suggested the Hammonds for some kind of lecture. Didn't matter what the topic was, didn't matter what the lecture was. Let's just get the Hammonds on campus and to have a time with them. You know, when you look back on your life, you say, who are the people that have profoundly influenced you and shaped you as mentors and as friends and as leaders? And I probably count the Hammonds way, way at the top of this list. You are free to look through their credentials and their bio, very long, very extensive, off the charts in terms of the work that they have done, their credentials. Between the two of them, they have 4 times the number of Harvard degrees than in our entire faculty, so let's just put that on the table. They are not only, in terms of their education, they're both medical doctors, trained as medical doctors, and have served their community as medical doctors. But in the more recent years, they've been serving, I think, Gloria, you still serve as a medical doctor, but their main work has been as co-pastors of Bethel AME in Boston, in the Jamaica Plain neighborhood of Boston. It is one of the most dynamic and exciting churches in the city, not just in Boston, but throughout. I had the great privilege of working alongside Pastor Ray in the ministry ministry of 10 Point Coalition, which is one of the most exciting ministries I've ever been involved in, which was a ministry to at-risk youth in the Boston area. And then to know and hear about Pastor Gloria's work in Darfur, Sudan, was one of the first Americans to actually know about this work and to be in the midst of the crisis in Darfur, Sudan. Pastor Gloria was one of the first to be there. So their credentials in terms of their ministry, their impact, if you are ever in the city of Boston and you want to know about what's going on, the Hammonds are the ones you want to go to and to learn from. I'm glad they're doing the preaching series, because the best sermon I've ever heard was actually given by Gloria. It was What a Girl Wants, What a Girl Needs. I don't know if you remember this. It was the best sermon because it was actually at the baby dedication of our daughter, Anna, who is now 18 years old, believe it or not. But the Hammonds were there to dedicate our daughter to the Lord, and it was unquestionably the best sermon I've ever heard. So I'm thankful that both of them, in their extremely busy schedules, are able to be here with us, and it's kind of who they are, to make time for others and to make time to serve others. I'll close with this one story, and then I'll turn it over to Pastors Ray and Gloria. I was doing a very tiny little event in Boston. It was like 15 people were scheduled to come, but I put it on Facebook that I was going to be in Boston, and I didn't expect anybody I knew to know would show up, but the Hammonds show up. It's a very small event downtown, and I was so surprised that they were there. I was so thankful that they were there. But the Hammonds are all apologetic because they came, I don't know, about 30 minutes late. They're so sorry. I'm so sorry that we're late. But we were over at the governor's mansion, and we were spending time with the governor, Patrick Duvall, and we couldn't get away any faster than this. At that point, Ray and Gloria, if you're with the governor of Massachusetts, I don't think you need to come to a gathering where there are 15 people hearing me lecture. That's the kind of graciousness, love, and just the mentoring that I've received from the Hammonds. So it is my great pleasure to introduce my mentors, my friends, my leaders, and my pastors, Ray and Gloria Hammond. Would you welcome them to our time?
Good evening. It is a blessing to be here with you today. I'm assuming most people sort of know each other, but just on the off chance that you don't, if there's anybody around you, if there's one or two people you don't, would you just take a moment and introduce yourself to them and say, welcome to this evening together? Excellent. Let me begin by just expressing my deep appreciation for this invitation on both the part of Gloria and myself, especially to my long-time friend, Dr. Sung-Chan Ra, who we had the opportunity to see at a seminal stage in his life and a seminal stage in the formation of our church. We had the opportunity to pastor together, and it is just a wonderful opportunity to be here and to share with him and with you. And our beloved friend, where is Dr. Elizabeth? Where is she? There she is. A phenomenal member of our church, tremendous part of that family, and we deeply miss her. But we're more than happy to lend her to you here at the North Park, and I know she's done a phenomenal job. I want to take a moment to take you back about 30 years and to let you know that for the most part, we're going to be leaning more on the pastoral ministry side of that Palmquist lecture than on the preaching, although I love preaching. And to tell you a story of development in ministry, and development in directions I had never imagined. I think Gloria would say exactly the same when she comes to share with you. But one of the things that made me realize that to the extent that you're willing to go to God, with God, into very difficult, strange, even painful territory, it's absolutely amazing where God will take you. We began about 30 years ago. A group of us gathered around, 5 of us, around our dining room table, the Bible study. Some sense that God wanted us to start a church. And we knew this had to be in a particular neighborhood. It's a neighborhood we had lived in for a number of years just before we had moved to where we were, not very far away still. It was a neighborhood that was called Mattapan, but everyone called it Murderpan, because it, like so many other neighborhoods in the 1980s, was really plunged into levels of violence that had been unseen in those communities. We knew God wanted us to do something about it. Had no idea how deep, as they say in The Matrix, one of my favorite films, how deep the rabbit hole would go. So I want you to just join with me this morning as we take a moment, or this evening as we take a moment to think about what it means to work in the realm of ministry to the marginal and outreach to the overlooked. The scripture I'd like to read from the Good News Translation is the Isaiah 58. There we go. Beginning in verse 9, when you pray, I will answer you. When you call to me, I will respond. If you put an end to oppression, to every gesture of contempt, and to every evil word, if you give food to the hungry and satisfy those who are in need, then the darkness around you will turn to the brightness of noon. And I will always guide you and satisfy you with good things. I will keep you strong and well. You will be like a garden that has plenty of water, like a spring of water that never goes dry. Your people will rebuild what has long been in ruins, building again on the old foundations. You will be known as the people who rebuilt the walls, who restored the ruined houses. My perspective on youth ministry is that of an urban African-American pastor and physician who's lived in inner city Boston 40 years and worked there for over 50 years. I was born and raised in Philadelphia. I was a civil rights baby, as Stephen Carter talks about. Those who often didn't participate directly but watched that movement unfold before their eyes and knew that they were indeed the direct beneficiary of the blood, sweat, tears, and sacrifice of others. I was also, when I came to Boston in 1967, a refugee from the streets of Philadelphia. My own neighborhood, I had watched go through a complete transition, and like many neighborhoods, first fairly solidly middle and working class, they were gripped by the problems of gang violence. And before it was all over, I would be a physician turned pastor whose ministry was absolutely changed by Boston's streets. It was on those streets that I saw all of the bad statistics reflected in the names and faces in communities which are in crisis. These are the communities where the sound of gunfire is no longer startling, where children identify street corners by the names of friends and acquaintances who were shot or killed there. These are the communities where there are a growing number of households struggling to make ends meet, with parents, often single mothers, striving to hold themselves and their families together while they try to raise boys who will not become fodder on the killing fields called urban streets, and daughters who will not grow old before their time. These are communities where children face high death rates, low expectations, and a future that is cloudy at best. In these communities, America's underworld, all the grim statistics about the fate of children in America are mirrored and multiplied. This is the land where a growing number of people work 40 hours or more a week and still cannot afford basic housing. Communities where nearly 1 in 5 children are poor, and that was true for America in 2016. That was more than 13.2 million children, and nearly 70% of those poor children were children of color. These are communities and a nation where gun violence remains the leading cause of death for black children and teens. In 2015, 9.5 out of every 100,000 black children and teens were killed with a gun, a rate 4 times higher than that for white children and teens. A black child or teen was killed with a gun every 7 hours and 25 minutes. Many of these children are the descendants of men and women who came out of the hell of slavery, passed into the fire of Jim Crow segregation, yet still managed to enter the previous century with strong backs, discipline, an incredible thirst for literacy, deep religious faith, and hope in the face of monumental adversity. These were men and women who knew all too well the oppressive force of racism, its denigration of their very humanity, its denial of the most basic of opportunities, and its detailed program of daily humiliation and abnegation. These were women and men who paid a heavy price, yet managed to hold families and communities together and mount movements for social justice, as if to declare to the forces of evil, in your face. The tragedy is that many of their descendants entered a new century in an economically and spiritually inferior position to their ancestors. This will be their fate not simply because of a society that is uncaring, but because sometimes, not even in the church, are there those who will reach out to find them and teach them the spiritual, historical, and intellectual truths they need to survive and thrive. Without that knowledge, they find themselves unable to interpret the present moment or see a more rational future through eyes of faith. And lacking the hope that sustained forebears, they are experiencing what Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson has called social death. But unlike the social death of formal slavery, this new death is fundamentally spiritual, rooted in the destruction of faith and hope. Now, one effort to reverse that death of faith and hope in Boston was an organization that I had the privilege of being a part of called the 10-Point Coalition. In 1992, after gang members disrupted a funeral, a number of inner-city pastors and lay people decided that it was less important to assign blame than it was to figure out their own responsibility and the responsibility of others toward a generation of young people. They decided to listen and learn from those young people, and it was that listening and learning that led to the 10-Point Plan and Coalition. After that listening period, let me share with you, there was a lot of discussion, particularly among the pastors, and I want to share with you something which became a little bit of a manifesto for many of us. And it actually became part of an op-ed that we printed in the local paper, the Boston Globe. We raised the question, churches, other houses of worship, and community-based organizations have to ask themselves hard questions. They must ask of themselves and others, who will go beyond analyzing and lamenting the demise of urban and poor communities and help to rebuild those communities with all the courage and sacrifice devoted to earlier movements for freedom and justice? If previous generations were willing to confront murderous Klansmen, why are we unwilling to confront our own violent children? We asked who will come down from the high mountain of sermons and public speeches to work consistently on the streets, with the schools, and in the prisons. Are we willing to do as a matter of love what we ask society to do as a matter of justice? Will we commit as much time and hard, cold cash to building lives as we do to building buildings? And who will reach out to the young men and women with their hats to the back, their pants down real low, and their guns not far away? What does our faith mean in the age of fear? If the God whom we serve is not able to protect us in the highways and byways where young men and women lie broken and bleeding, of what use is that God and that faith to a generation struggling to survive? Those are the questions we had to really wrestle with. And as we did that, as we began to talk to young people and to their families, we came to the point of recognizing that we had to do more than think about it. We really had to begin to address it. Now, I want to emphasize that as we began that process, thankfully, we were not operating in a vacuum. If I can get there we go. All right. There were already substantial law enforcement, criminal justice, and other community efforts to address this issue, including the City Street Workers Program, a police gang unit that focused particularly on what we would call proven risk youth, the beginning of community policing, which at that time was still considered a relatively new idea, the formation of police probation collaborations really aimed at prevention and not just catching people. The Youth Violence Strike Force and programs like Operation Ceasefire, which went beyond police and probation to bring the community in as a norm-setting mechanism and a mechanism for communicating hope to young people. As a consequence, we decided we would pull together what we called the 10-Point Coalition as an ecumenical group of Christian clergy and lay leaders whose goal was to mobilize the greater Boston community and especially Christian local church community around the issues affecting Black and Latino youth. And we were particularly focused on those at the highest risk for violence and other destructive behaviors. In its final form, that coalition called upon churches, church agencies, and the academic theological community to do several things. And I'll just come to those. Okay. Sorry. There we go. Okay. First, to establish 4 to 5 church clusters which would adopt and evangelize youth gangs. We often suggested to people they just start with the 4 or 5 blocks immediately around their churches and make a concerted effort to really get to know those young people. Secondly, to understand that young people were not going to come to you, you had to go to them. And that meant if you were serious, you needed to commission missionaries who would be back in the courts as advocates and ombudsmen for the juveniles who were turning up there. And we had every indication that, in fact, the courts would have been extremely excited. I'll never forget having the conversation with a judge who said, "I remember the days when priests and ministers were all over this court. Where did you go?" We suggested that we even go to the effort of commissioning youth evangelists who were prepared to address educational and economic needs and to do street-level work with the local drug dealers. That they would also work on developing concrete and specific partnerships with local schools. That those schools would also build spiritual, human resource, and material linkages between downtown and suburban churches and inner city churches and ministries. That they would work on the economic needs, as I mentioned here before, initiate and support neighborhood crime watches, not just for the purposes of really watching out for crime, but helping to really build the fabric of community and connection. To really focus in a very special way on the relationships between churches and community health centers that would facilitate pastoral counseling for families, that would address mental health needs which were frequently overlooked for those who were affected by trauma and stress. We were looking for Christian sisterhoods and brotherhoods as a rational alternative to gang life. We wanted to ask whether we could begin to establish in our churches rape crisis drop-in centers, services for battered women, and counseling for abusive men, because we had a pretty good idea that a lot of the violence we were seeing on the streets was mimicking violence that children first learned at home. And finally, we were asking for a church-based and a God-centered history curriculum with an additional focus on the struggle of women and poor people. Now, implementing that required that we first come together to pray, hard, long, and collectively. We needed urban and suburban pastors and lay people, young and old, who were willing to cry out to God on behalf of the city in small gatherings and large rallies, in the daytime, in the evening, and sometimes all night long. Those people worked in prayer vigils and prayer walks and cornerside prayer and preaching crusades. And then we had to learn how to work with one another. That meant not just forming the usual steering committees, but really working on building trust and learning how to collaborate. And we did that through a whole series of things, including collectively listening to the voices of those with whom we would need to collaborate. And so that led to meetings with school headmasters, with police officers on the beat and also in the command structure. It led to finding places and spaces to celebrate police who were doing the right thing and also to hold accountable those who were doing the wrong thing. Father's Day marches, summits on violence, mentoring institutes, bringing together a citywide clergy against violence, which were both ecumenical and interfaith efforts that in one case really helped to mediate a dispute at a local high school. to begin the serious process of Protestant Roman Catholic dialogue and then Jewish Christian dialogue. And so it went on until by 2014, as a consequence of that work over many years, that coalition had grown to about 57 churches with 6 full-time staff and a part-time staff member, a board of 15. But over all of those years, the main things that we did really fell into 3 categories, and I want to share what those are. One was capacity building. I would argue that the most important things that we did were not in any way really the direct services. Those were important. But the real goal was not just to serve more young people, but to change the way the church thought about its mission, to open the church up, to open its doors up, to be willing to respond when a local street worker came to me and said, you know, I've got kids and you've got buildings and vans. What do you think about us forming a partnership? And we discovered that when the church would signal that it was open and willing, it was absolutely amazing who would search them out. We found out probation departments would search them out. Police departments would search them out. School police would search them out. All kinds of people would come if, in fact, they found that the church was open and willing to try to find a way to make a difference. And so we discovered that the capacity building, getting churches to the place where they were comfortable, they saw it as part of their mission. If we could organize them, if we could train them, if we could help them see other possibilities for ministry, this was the most important thing that we could do. Secondly, we could offer services that were innovative and effective. We could offer services not only ourselves, but help to connect people, families and young people to those services. And last but not least, we could play a role as an advocate. We could advocate on the city and the state and even the national level. We could put our voices behind the kind of policies that would make a difference for the young people and families we were trying to serve. And so let me just give you a couple of examples of some of that direct service work. And this is, if you will, graded along its level of difficulty. And so when we would start out, we would start with things that were relatively easy for people. So the easy stuff, this is the easy lifting, was what we would call the night walks, in which we would ask people to simply take a step of faith and walk around a neighborhood that you were very unfamiliar with. And the last time you saw it, it was the scene of violence or a murder on television. So we were asking you to go beyond your fear, beyond your stereotypes, and just be there, along with residents from that neighborhood. These were what we would call hotspot neighborhoods. We would ask people to walk on weekends and sometimes weekdays, in nights, beginning generally around 9 o'clock, maybe going till around 11 or midnight. Their responsibility was to, in the company of community groups from that neighborhood, be out there both to raise their own awareness, but also to let young people know that they were cared for and cared about. That was step level 1. If churches found that that was something that over time they could become a little more comfortable, we would invite them to become a part of what we called memorial programs. We had discovered some time ago that, in fact, and no one has really documented exactly what the percentage is, but that a significant number of murders, and certainly shootings, are the consequence of revenge. They're a consequence, they flow out of something that happened a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. And that if there was a possibility for redirecting people's anger and rage, it might be possible, and I would add grief, it might be possible to prevent additional murders and shootings down the road. And so the churches took on the responsibility for, in the first anniversary, and sometimes, depending on what they heard, even second or third anniversaries, convening an opportunity to remember the person, but also to remind those that came after them to think about the ways in which they would want to make their life meaningful and to connect that sense of meaning, not with more violence, but with peace. If churches were able to do that, we then discovered that in many cases they were willing to become the hosts or the volunteers in night drop-in centers, either in the churches themselves or in local community groups. And these were places that were real havens for many of these young people in a heartless world. Places where they could find activities, where they could find mentors and youth workers, where transportation was provided, but it was a place of safety, particularly in the summer months and on the holidays. And then the next step was to move into what we called Second Chance or Operation Home Front. And this was where, in fact, we not only began working with the young people, but with their families. This came out of work and and certainly the middle school teachers were pretty clear about it. They knew what the markers were. They knew the family markers. They knew the academic achievement markers or lack thereof. They understood at that point. And so their point was to try to see if you, before they get caught up, can you somehow intervene? And that was the basis on which the Boston police and Boston school police and clergy and lay volunteers began a process of trying to reach out to youth and family at a critical time. And that conversation involved not just the young person, but family members, giving them information about the resources that were available, the signs, the gang signs to look out for. But most of all, trying to get a conversation going with parents who often felt incredibly overwhelmed. I don't know if you have this problem here in Boston, but time and again, we saw parents literally working 2 or 3 jobs. They would have loved to go to the school meetings, but they had to choose between food on the table, a place to live, and being available in the ways that they wanted to for their children. The next step was to begin the process of using those same efforts, not just in homes, but also in schools. And I'm showing you just a graph from one intervention at a high school there, which had been terribly disrupted over a space of a few months or so. And a whole series of things were done, not the least of which was working with the families and the identified young people in that high school. And over the course of about 6 months, that school experienced a decrease in violent behavior by 87.5%. It's another mark of the difference that a community can make. In those first 3 years, because of the commitment of those volunteers, there were 190 anti-violence presentations to 18,000 young people, and 2,000 families were visited in their homes and followed up with. So again, the church really can make a difference. There were efforts to reach out at the next level to young people in detention. And that was what was called the Department of Youth Services Ministry, in which volunteer teams from 7 churches would visit 100 youth in care of the Department of Youth Services weekly for group discussion, tutoring, and informal mentoring. Others went on to become part of what we would call crisis intervention teams. At the time of a homicide, a volunteer would be sent out. That could be a clergy person or a lay person. They would offer both counseling services and their presence. In the wake of that, particularly in the area that was most affected, they would be conducting street patrols, prayer walks. They were there at the funerals to offer the grief counseling that was needed, the trauma intervention that was needed, and finally they would provide support to grieving families over the long haul. There were efforts to begin to reach those who were re-entering from incarceration. And I'll take note of the fact that none of this is particularly surprising, this approach with case managers and mentors. But what was wonderful to uphold was that in a 1-year study, the recidivism rate for this group was 1.5%. Over 5 years, it was about 10% versus the normal 35 to 49% that was seen. So what we know over and over again is that when the church is available, when lay and clergy from the church will reach out, they really can rebuild streets. They really can bring together those in a community who are often afraid. Last but not least, and I'll say a little bit very briefly about this, in the 2000s or the aughts, we recognized that rather than trying to do blanket work, one of the things that perhaps the church could do is to be the peacemakers that Jesus called it to be. To that end, we began to really look at efforts at negotiating successful truces and ceasefires, put together a protocol along with the street workers in the city and people from the negotiation project at Harvard, and then said, can we apply this in the context of getting gangs to negotiate truces and peace? It turned out that, in fact, you could do it. And the first, what we would call summit, was actually held at the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston, at the invitation of the director there, who was looking for some way to be helpful to the community. And so he was in neutral territory. We could bring everybody there, and the first summit was conducted. Now, I'll come back and tell you some of the results with all of these in just a moment, but I don't want to close without saying that we also recognize that if there were things going on legislatively in terms of laws and policies that were having an adverse impact on the lives of these young people, we had a responsibility to try as best we could to change those policies. And that's why we got involved in the advocacy work. The Youth Move Boston was one of the most exciting parts of that because that was training young people to advocate for themselves. And the second and critical piece of that was to really mobilize the larger community around a series of issues, including what we would call Corey reform, allowing people to not be hampered for the rest of their lives by criminal records, state funds for summer activities, referenda around criminal justice issues, and I am happy to say, after 15 years of work, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts this past year passed a 100-page bill of comprehensive criminal justice reform. A lot of work for that. But it showed us in so many ways that if the church, in a way, and I don't mean this in any way pejoratively, takes itself seriously, if it believes that its gospel really can shake the foundations of hell itself, then it can really help to tear those gates down. I'll never forget a conversation that I had with a judge who pulled me aside at the end of a case and said to me something that I've never forgotten. He said, Pastor Hammond, you know, I've sat on this bench for 30 years, and the one thing with which I am at peace is that I don't change people. I can incapacitate people. I can incarcerate people. I can incentivize people. But he says, I don't really change people. He said, that's really what you do. That's what this thing you call faith in the gospel is supposed to do. And he says, I've seen that. I've seen that. I've seen people who I had given up on who came back into my court with someone else, perhaps, a family member, and they were changed. And his great challenge to me was to ask if the church could somehow mobilize that changing power that it has to make a difference in the lives that he saw every day. Let me just give you some indication of what a difference it can make. And this is not based on our work. This is the work of the sociology department at Harvard University, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. This is the evaluation of a lot of other people. In that first effort in the 1990s, Boston had the sharpest drop in homicide rates in the nation, and it was unusual in that a group of ministers, and I have to keep saying clergy, keep saying lay people, because the media, God bless them, love the unusual and the strange. So if they can focus on the fact that clergy are out there with their collars on, and that's what sticks in their mind. I can't say enough that without the engine of lay involvement, this would have been absolutely impossible. The Boston 10-Point Coalition is attributed with playing a key role in reducing youth homicides. And that's just a measure of the comparative drop during that time. The drop was the sharpest in the nation, 61.2% between 1990 and 96, from 152 homicides to 59. That drop was sustained, 43 in 97, 35 in 1998, and for a 29-month period ending in January 1998, Boston had no teenage homicide victims. This is the work of Anthony Braga, David Heroux, Christopher Winship, as in the monogram that they published. Boston received national acclaim for its innovative approach to preventing youth violence. The ceasefire strategy was associated with a near two-thirds drop in youth homicides. That Boston approach was also noted for its extraordinary police-community relationship. The wonderful thing that happened in Boston, by comparison with countries or cities that pursued what was called the broken windows approach, intensive enforcement, stop and search, was that we saw an actual improvement in police-community relations, not a deterioration. We'll go on to move on. Let's move on to there. Given the history of poor race relations in the city of Boston, it was remarkable that any group of black community members was able to forge such a highly productive partnership with the Boston Police Department. I shared with you earlier that 5-year 10% recidivism rate with ex-offenders who normally had an average in Massachusetts of 44% recidivism. Program costs for those who were involved in the reentry program were about $5,300 per client per year, versus more than $23,000 per inmate per year. And that figure has gone up quite a bit since that time. This is the second phase that I mentioned to you in the aughts, when we went and focused in addition on this mediating role, this peacemaking role. And this was done by Anthony Braga, in which he showed that shootings by gang mediation initiative gangs representing some of the most violent groups in Boston decreased by 39% between 2007 and 2009. So that is where we were as we entered into the 21st century. And what you see here, and this is the last piece that I want to talk about, because this gets to where we think we need to go now. The good news was that we were well below the peak. In our worst years, we were at the half of the peak that we saw in the 1990s. That said, we have remained at this stubborn level, somewhere between 35 and 60 or up to 70 homicides a year. And the question is, what do we do about that? And part of the problem, I think, that we've come to appreciate is that as wonderful as the work is, we are still mopping the floor instead of fixing the faucet. And that's the challenge that we faced next. And I want to share with you what we think we have to do. And then Gloria's going to come and share a little bit of the work that we were involved in as the Lord had opened an opportunity for her, and indeed our entire church, first through the women in our church. We think that the key now revolves in some ways around Exodus 20. And what we want to look at now is the ways in which, whether you see that as being what I would call descriptive or prescriptive, the sins of mothers and fathers are passed on to the third and fourth generation. For those of you particularly interested in it, there's a great book out now by Fox Butterfield called In My Father's House. It's the bookend to another book that he did called All of God's Children about 10 or 15 years ago. In the first, he looked at a black family and traced the thread of violence from slavery to the present. In this case, he's now looking at a poor white family on the West Coast and tracing that same thread of violence over 3 to 4 generations. We think the next key is an intervention that really gets to the family roots. And why do I say that? Well, in part because of work that came out of my neighborhood. And I'm trying to see what. Okay. I'm sorry that these are not showing, but I can tell you what they said. In 2003, our local community foundation made a grant and asked if the Northeastern University, which has a criminology program, would take a look at the neighborhood in which my wife and I have lived for 30 years. It's called Grove Hall. They then wanted to ask who in that neighborhood over a 3-year period has had what's called a field interview or an arrest. What they discovered, not surprisingly, was that out of the 19,600 residents of my neighborhood, 457 people accounted for every arrest and every field interview over that period of time. It's 2.5% of the population. Those 457 people had between them been arraigned in court 12,000 times. It's an average of 30 per person. What was really exciting was that they then cross-referenced those set of names across all state agencies: mental health, Department of Children's Families, public health. They looked at every agency and said, have you had contact with this person? And not surprisingly, there was a 72% match. So the folks that the police were looking at were the same people that all of the agencies were dealing with day in and day out. They then asked themselves, who in this group might be amenable to intervention? Who's amenable to prevention? Who needs intervention? And then who's at a point where they need enforcement, or as we would say, a sabbatical at the cost of the government, or a prison ministry. And one of the things about our group was that we had no compunction if someone was really causing havoc to ask that they be locked up, for 2 reasons. 1, they were likely to hurt somebody, and 2, they were likely to be killed themselves. That victim-perpetrator label is constantly being switched basically across the same small group of people. So they then asked, well, what do we know about the relationships between the 457 people? And not surprisingly, when they got social workers, people who lived in the community over a long period of time together, they discovered that almost all of them, almost 60, 65%, were part of 5 large family systems in that neighborhood. And if anyone had lived there any length of time, they could have told them already who the 5 families were. They started beginning to put together family trees, and I'm going to show you one family tree, a part of one of those family systems in my neighborhood. 4 generations, and the reason for which this family drew attention is because if you look on the bottom level, well over 2/3 of the folks there are on that list of 457 people. Now, there's another list, and I'll describe that another time, which is even more specific. But we went on to try to figure out what could be done with each of those people, and what do we know about them. Here's the neighborhood, and I used to have a little pointer here to show you exactly where my house is. It's sort of in the middle here, not far from the big park there. This family, let's begin to look at the indicators. How many of them ever arrested across 4 generations? How many incarcerated? How many are currently under the supervision of the criminal justice system? This particular slide surprised us because when we asked about gang involvement, and I know this may not be surprising in Chicago, where your gangs are very hierarchical, highly structured, and big. In Boston, it was never like that. A big gang is 100 people. A massive gang is 150. But what we had not appreciated was that while people are not multi-generationally in the same gang, they are multi-generationally in different gangs. And so the phenomenon is carrying across generations. How many were involved in firearm offenses, either as a victim, a suspect, or both? How many arrested for assault and battery with a dangerous weapon? How many engaged in reported domestic violence? How many involved in drug possession and distribution? 4 generations deep. When you start to look at the social indicators, you also begin to see the other correlates, including those who are truant, delinquent, not graduating, dropped out. And in this case, the big marker, of course, is being consigned to special education. How many have spent time in a DYS facility? That's our juvenile detention system. And this, again, is another, DSS was our Department of Children and Families. It's the agency which receives reports for abuse. This was the other one that was very interesting, though not surprising to us. How many people with known, diagnosed, treated mental illness? Now, what we don't often get at is the undiagnosed. And that became a key piece in some of the after-school work that we did in our local church, not with the 10-Point Coalition. The thing that really awakened us was the example of a young man who was sent to us just before he was about to be kicked out of school and put into an alternative educational system. At the time, we had a member of our church who was a psychologist who was working as a volunteer. And after sitting with that young man for 30 minutes, he said, "There's no question this boy has got post-traumatic stress disorder." He began working with them, and in 6 months, we saw a kid on his way to alternative ed become an honor roll student at his school. And that was when we first asked, how many other young people are being misdiagnosed, put into alternative ed, or, as they would feel it, pushed out of school because no one understands the diagnosable mental or emotional illness that they are struggling with. Substance abuse, huge factor in this family across 4 generations, and other agency involvement. I want to just close by sharing this thought with you. 27 years ago in the city of Boston, a group of young men who had come to pay their respects to a friend shot through the head at a party went berserk when they spotted a member of a rival gang at the funeral. In the ensuing melee, the supposed intruder was chased around the church, stabbed several times, and shot at, while funeral goers were injured, stampeding for the single available exit. In the aftermath of that terrible event, 300 clergy showed up at the church to express their outrage and to pledge their support. Hundreds were involved in the press conferences that were held, the pastoral epistles that were written, the preaching oratory dispensed in every possible direction, and the meetings that were held. But was it possible that we missed what the Bible was trying to tell us in Matthew 18:15, when it says, if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault? These young men had sinned greatly against the community of which they were a part and this local church. But almost nobody would go to them. And it's hard to tell whether that's because the church does not believe the word is true, or because they do not believe that these young children are their brothers and sisters. And so only a few went to discover that there were young men who wanted to apologize for what had happened and who wanted to explain to others the brutal realities they faced every day. Only a few went to talk with these young men, still wrestling with their grief over the death of their friend and their willingness to discuss whether they should kill 2 members of the other gang to settle the score before calling a truce. Only a few went. And though the numbers have increased, thankfully, more still need to go. going to take a few questions, and Gloria's going to kick us off for the second half.
Thank you again, Pastor Reagan. Wonderful. We're going to take about like 2 to 3 questions, Paul. 10 minutes. Yes, say your name, please, when you use the mic. And for those online, please direct your questions to Paul, and we'll get them too. So the floor is open. Any questions for Pastor Ray? Yes.
Hi, Mary Chase Solik. I'm very interested in the connections between faith and health, and I'd be interested in hearing on how your medical training has influenced your pastoring in this work.
Ooh, where to start? And Gloria can really touch on this even more. At the minimal level, it, I think, has made us very sensitive to the issues that families face with serious illness and hospitalization. And that's even played out in the way we both advise members, advocate in some cases on their behalf, teach them to advocate for themselves in the healthcare system. If she has time, Gloria can tell you a little bit about the work that she's now doing to try to get churches deeply involved in having families have the conversation about serious illness and death and end of life, so that we don't watch families tear each other apart because there's no agreement on what we should have done for mom or dad. Right? So that because we've seen so much of this, it's influenced us. Now, on the advocacy side, in a very interesting way, because we know the impact, our church, along with a number of other groups that we work with, played actually a fairly big role in the passage of what was called Romney Care in Massachusetts, and that became the basis. This group that we are part of gathered 50,000 signatures to put the referendum on the ballot, and the only reason we did that was to force the legislature to really deal with this. So it's been a big part. Last piece I'll say is, too, we take very seriously mental health, very seriously.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Mike Walker, theologian of disability. My name's not that important. Thank you, Dr. Hammond. I was struck by the Isaiah 58 passage that you read at the beginning. That's one of my favorites. What does the end of oppression look like in that context?
Well, I think the first level is people not being afraid to sit on their porch or let their children play. Kind of a Maslow level 1 need, the sense of some measure of reasonable safety and security. And then we also have to begin to look, I think, beyond that, as you say, the lifting of the other oppressive forces, whether they are the undersourced educational system, or the multitude of ways in which the mistakes of your youth become unforgivable and dog you for a lifetime. One of the reasons why we were so committed to Corey reform, because in fact we discovered people were never getting even to the second base. Nobody was even talking to them about where they were now versus where they were when they committed that crime 10 years ago, and so on. So the incredible thing is that the layers of oppression are multiple, and they are personal, and they are familial, and they are cultural, and they are societal. It's literally unpeeling the onion.
Questions? Anything online, Paul? Okay. Okay, 15 people listening. All right, great. Any other questions? Any questions? Don't be shy. Do you have one? No? Okay.
In the second half, Gloria will be talking about, in the same way that we had to face the violence, if you will, without, we discovered that we also had to deal with the violence within the house. And Gloria will really be focusing on that as we come to this second part.
Okay. Thank you again, Dr. Ray Hammond.
If we can begin to take our seats, I'm going to start at 8. And we had the great privilege of hearing from Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond. And in our second session, we'll hear from Reverend Dr. Gloria Hammond. So please welcome Reverend Dr. Gloria Hammond.
There we go. I just wanted to begin by responding to the question that I think someone posed about how we do this medicine and ministry part. And people are often curious about this journey. We've been married now 45 years and 8 months and about 10 days, as a matter of fact, and probably about 8 hours. So when we met while we were actually an undergraduate, and our plan was to go to medical school, and we were going to practice medicine. I was planning to do pediatrics, and Ray was going to be doing surgery. And that plan was pretty much in place until Ray was just right after he began his residency, his internship, and he felt that the Lord was calling him to preach, and so he began the process of being ordained in our congregation. That was going to be okay because he could do a little preaching, maybe do Bible study on Wednesday night, but we were still going to live in a big house in the suburb with 3 garages for our 4 cars, right? So, but once it was really clear that he felt a sense of being called to build a church, that put us into a very different category, and we'll talk about what that experience was like for us afterwards. But with regard to the medicine and ministry, there is a way that we really think about this that is, we understand it to be the difference between career and calling. And early on, the choice was whether or not we were going to pursue the standard career in medicine, or respond to God's calling. And so we understand what we do really as a ministry of healing, which is the way that we have come to understand that we integrate all of the different things that we do. And certainly I can say I don't know how to be either or. I know how to be a physician, and I know how to be a minister, and I know how to be a minister of healing. And so that's the way we integrate it. And as you can imagine, it very much informs the kinds of ministries that we get involved with. Obviously, we can provide very sophisticated pastoral care for our congregants when they are in need of medical care, because we can certainly access people that we've been knowing for many years and the work that we've done over the years. So that's how it all comes together. And I was, again, planning to do standard medicine until I also, for many years, had the sense that the Lord was calling me to preach. It was not a good idea for him to do that. But at some point, it was clear that I needed to do that. So I was actually practicing my pediatrics in an urban health center when I also went to do seminary and finished seminary and was ordained in our congregation. So we actually encourage all of our members to think about what they do not as careers, but to think about it as ministry. So teachers are not just teachers, they're ministers of education. And business people are ministers of commerce. And lawyers are ministers of justice. And that means then that regardless of where I am, whether I'm operating in the church or whether I'm operating on my job, I'm doing ministry. And I'm reaching out to my colleagues as well as my clients to really understand what it is that God might be doing in me to minister to them, and how I might be a witness to them. So does it make sense now? Does it all come together? Okay. Yes. And we also want to thank Dean Perry. Thank you, honey. Dean Perry. Dean Perry, yes, thank you so much for this invitation. And again, it means so very, very much to us. So we appreciate the opportunity. Look forward to spending more time with you. I'm going to do a little bit about some of the other work that we've been involved in, and in particular talk about the work that we got involved with in Africa, because as you understand, it's all about ministry, and then connected with some of the work that we're doing currently at Bethel. And then again, people are often curious about our personal journey, and we'll share some of the lessons that we've learned along the way. In 2001, Ray and I were invited to the southern part of Sudan, South Sudan, which had been embroiled in a bitter genocidal civil war, eventually for over 20 years, against the northern government. The conflict had escalated the trafficking, the slave trafficking, and in particular, southern captives were taken to the north where they were enslaved, and essentially did the same kinds of obligations and experienced some of the same kinds of abuses that my ancestors did. And so we were invited to travel with a group of ministers to bear witness to the very elaborate underground railroad that was developed in order to identify the slaves and return them to their villages in the South. What was remarkable is that most of these returning slaves were actually women and children. And over the trip, we listened to their stories, and what was remarkable for me was the kinds of abuse that people endured. And in particular, the stories of sexual violence, which for me at the time were unconscionable. People talked about women were primarily domestic workers in the homes of their masters. They lived outside among the cattle and goat, ate food that was left over after the master's family had died. And again, horrendous stories of especially sexual violence for the women and also for the children. So the same stories, I heard iterations of these same stories when I subsequently went to Darfur in Western Sudan. And again, for me, the whole notion of gender-based violence became a reality that I had only heard about, but began to hear up close and personal as women were recounting their stories. Gender-based violence is unique in that it targets individuals or groups of individuals on the basis of their gender. And it's not just the physical harm, there are the other kinds of harms that women experience, and that all victims of gender-based violence experience that very deep trauma, and includes a variety of acts. That this is the definition from the UN Convention on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And it begged this question for me: who will be my sister's keeper? And it's something with which I struggled, because what I recognize is for me to get engaged in this work of advocacy would put me in a very uncomfortable place, because I am actually by nature, I'm the introvert in the family. I'm the one who would be very content to be in that very back row in the corner and not saying much of anything. But for me to take on a role with regard to what I had seen in both South Sudan and in Western Sudan would put me in a spotlight and in an uncomfortable position of speaking up and speaking out about a situation. And I remember one night having seen a little boy whose face was distorted. He was in a crowd of several hundred slaves who were returning back to their villages. And when I saw the degree of distortion, I assumed that it was a congenital deformity, because I've certainly seen pretty significant deformities. When I approached his mother, she explained that in fact he was born normally, that what I was seeing, the degree of disfigurement, was a function of the fact that he, as a boy, was charged to keep the cattle and goats. He lost a cow, and so his masters chopped his nose off. And that's what I was seeing. And as I lay in my tent that night and could hear gunshots in the distance, I wrestled and said, God, I can't do this. And it was one of those very poignant moments when I heard God saying very clearly that I had been raised up for such a time for this. And the question was whether I was willing to intervene to address a situation for current slaves in such a way that was not done for my ancestors 400 years ago. And so with great trepidation, I said yes, and but joined together with a group of, there were 6 of us who were warrior women who became my sister's keeper. And our vision was that we would really focus on supporting women worldwide to create what we call vibrant and joyous communities. And what I recognized in doing that work and traveling so often to into Sudan and South Sudan and to Thailand and Burma and Chad, as I began working with other women who were victims of conflict, the thing that was so obvious had really been obscure to me, and I began to see in a new way that the degree of sexual violence that these women were experiencing, it wasn't only over there, it was also over here. And interestingly, the Lord had to take me all the way over there, thousands and thousands of miles, over more trips than I can count, to be able to see more starkly that we had tremendous degrees of sexual violence here as well. We know this to be true. You've certainly seen these numbers, especially in the past year, that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience some form of contact sexual violence in their lifetime. This is from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. And so this reminds me of this. People remember the Yellow Pages? Well, in the Yellow Pages, one of the big ads that I remember when you'd get these big books of Yellow Pages of all of the businesses in your area, what their logo is, if it's out there, then it's in here. And so if there's a business out there, then you're going to find it in here. And the same thing is true with regard to sexual violence, that if there's violence out there, there's violence in here. If there are drugs out there are drugs in here. And so that really compelled me to look more deeply at what was happening here. And what that meant was that on any given Sunday, and this is Easter Sunday at Bethel, 1 out of 3 of the women and 1 out of 6 of the men worshiping in my congregation on an Easter Sunday morning either were, are being, or will be victims of sexual violence. That became the impetus for us beginning another work that we call our Shatter the Silence work. And this is an initiative, again, we for many years have done some work around sexual violence, but really intensified it once I started working in Sudan and South Sudan. The Shatter the Silence begins by naming sexual violence. We can say these things in the church. And declaring to people that it is a real thing, and that it's not only, again, a real thing out there, It's a real thing in here. And our commitments are to create a safe, healing environment for congregants, both victims and victimizers. Because the truth is that if we have victims in the church, we have victimizers. And the church needs to be the place that offers redemption for all. Now, some of us are going to find redemption in the prison ministry. And that's a perfectly fine way to find redemption if that's what's required for someone who is guilty of violating someone else. But the point is that we, in a different way than perhaps the world, need to be a place where we offer salvation and redemption to all of us. We may get there differently, but we all need to be able to get there. And we are really deeply committed to creating a congregation where people will select to come here because we know these people will talk about what I've been through and will offer healing resources. And so this is a Sunday when, after our last year Shatter the Silence Sunday, we have Go Red Sunday and we have Think Pink Sunday for breast cancer. And so we also have Shatter the Silence Sunday, where these are T-shirts that women did who talking about their experience with sexual violence. And this was the backdrop for our Sunday morning worship. We're also deeply committed then to preaching and teaching from texts that promote healthy relationships and do not perpetuate what people sometimes identify as rape culture. And it's been interesting over the last few years to really look at texts and to take a tough look at texts and to see the multiple places where rape culture really does get taught. Last year, I preached from Judges 18. Anybody know Judges 18? This is seminary, so you all probably know Judges 18, the story of in Judges 18. It is probably, I kind of stumbled on it a few years ago, and it was just so heinous that it was hard to read it, but it's the story of the concubine, and through a series of events, this concubine is offered to rapists, and the text says that she was raped all night long, and in the morning crawls back to the house, and her owner steps over her and tells her, "Get up, we need to go." She dies on their way back to home. He then cuts up her body into 12 pieces and distributes it to the various tribes. And when I read this, I said, oh God, there is absolutely why is this in there? But we preached about that and really looked at the different ways in which rape culture was identified, and began to trace the redemption through Jesus Christ. That Jesus has a heart for hurting women. And after the 8 o'clock service, when I preached this, and again, I'm wondering, why is this even in the Bible? What is this? A lawyer came up to me and said that while he was a student, he had worked in the prisons. And one of his clients was a man who had cut up his girlfriend, and so he was in jail. And I then went to Google women cut up after sexual violence, and all over the world there were stories popping up of women who had been cut up after being sexually violated. So the reason it's in there, that story is in there, is because it's out here. And so the challenge for us is to really look at texts and to even consider what texts get preached and how they get preached and what kind of messages that we send that do not promote healthy relationships. We are also deeply committed to ensuring that we have the policies in place to actually prevent, but if something does happen, to be able to address this sexual violence. And in that context, as Ray has already alluded to, if you're going to do this work of educating, we also have to do the work of advocacy. Because like he suggested, it really is that broken faucet, and we keep mopping it up, or we keep putting out a bucket, which is, so that but at some point, what is wrong with this faucet? And what are we going to do to fix this faucet so that we don't have to have these kind of leaks? So advocacy is also a critical piece of our work. We have partnered with the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center, which in Boston is doing some of the most innovative work around sexual victimization. And they have actually, this year, they are doing their training for us. And so once a month, they'll come in and we'll look at some aspect of their training with regard to sexual violence. And so this year we have now 10 women and 2 men who significantly are the pastor of the church, my husband, and our youth pastor who are dealing with this topic. And I'm very clear that the group that we certainly want to address everybody, but we especially want to make sure that we're taking care of these young girls and young men. And the reason, this is like our youth choir. And these are our youth ushers. And it's significant to have them in mind because of this data. This is, again, the data from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. And if you look at it, someone can quickly do the math for me, but the age at the time of the first completed rape, according to this data, 2010 to 2012, 12% of women are under 10 years. 31% are between 11 and 17. So that means, what's the math? 43% of women who are sexually violated come to Sunday school. And they're the youth choir. And they're the junior ushers. 37% are the young adults. So we're looking at, of the people who report completed rape, 80% of them are our youth or young adults. So we are very clear that we're here to support everybody, and part of your message is once you're strengthened, you've got to help your brother or sister. And again, we are keenly aware that just like we have victims, current victims, we have future victims, we have future victimizers. So the message needs to go to all of us that we have work to do. And I am firmly persuaded that, that this is a moment. And God has a message for people who've been sexually violated. And it's a message that can promote healing and restoration. And I know that in a very personal way. And so I'm going to
I stand.
Look at this video that we prepared.
I stand against sexual victimization.
Sexual victimization is non-consensual sexual contact that happens from one person to another person.
This is a subject I think that our church has been concerned with, committed to, working through for a very, very long time. It's an issue in our family. It's something my wife experienced.
I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, so I certainly know the impact that it's had on my life. And for me, it was almost 60 years ago, and I can say that I'm still kind of dealing with the residue of that.
It often happens early in a person's life, and the consequences can be devastating for them, for the people around them. I think it has, in many cases, multi-generational impact.
Sexual victimization is a scourge that affects all of us.
We know that from statistics that it really is impossible to have a congregation of people where no one has this experience, and yet we're really not talking about it.
And the darkness in the world doesn't go away just because you walk into a church. It's extremely important for us to talk about it, otherwise it's swept under the rug.
I think that you can't really say it's a woman's issue or a man's issue or a children's issue because it really is everybody, and it could be anybody.
I think the church really doesn't know the amount, the number of people who might have gone through something like this, who have a story to tell.
the act of violence it is becomes the epicenter of an earthquake of other actions and reactions. And so there's just great sense that what happens to one happens to us all.
I'm also a survivor of sexual assault, so I wanted to be here to empower other women and also to empower myself.
Courage is needed in order to shatter the silence. Courage is needed to face the perpetrator. Courage is needed to share your story.
I want to empower someone else, and I feel like the church needs to support that, needs to support me in telling my story. And I feel like this is a great start.
The source of it needs to be dealt with, and the church is the place for it because the healing is there.
I think in this way we are really tearing Satan's kingdom down in a very tangible way.
What I have learned over these years in terms of my own healing and being an instrument for healing for countless other men and women over the years is that God is still in the healing business.
As long as people have this sense that they're by themselves, that they're the only one who's broken, they're the only one who's feeling this kind of shame and humiliation and anger and whatever, it'll remain hidden. So part of it is to say to people, you're not alone.
I was a victim, and now I'm an overcomer and a thriver. I think that's just the most powerful message that the church has to give.
I think that's maybe the most important thing. You don't have to carry this secret anymore. It's time to bring the secret out, and whatever hold it has over you, whatever hurt it's done to you, let's begin to heal that.
I stand against sexual victimization because I am determined that no other person will ever experience the pain that I've known.
I stand for love.
I stand.
I stand.
I stand.
I stand.
I stand for truth.
I stand for healing.
I stand for courage.
I stand for the survivors.
I stand for shattering the silence.
And draw your attention to the number of congregations who have come together to address this issue and the foundations that have been such wonderful supporters. So I think that the exciting possibility that what the church can bring to this is in many ways to reframe the Me Too message and to recognize that if my sister is offended, then I'm offended. If my brother's been raped, then I've been raped. And so to transform #MeToo into #WeToo. And therefore we all have obligations and opportunities to come together to respond to this issue. We have about half an hour, babe, and I know you had a little more to present. Okay. A few things that we've learned along the way, and I'm full of stories, and so there's another one that comes to mind, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But when you asked about what are the ways that medicine shows up in terms of the work that we do at Bethel and beyond, one of the early lessons that I learned when I was in residency was the importance of really speaking to people's spiritual needs. One of the other things that I do now is, you probably saw in the bio, is I'm a resident scholar at Harvard Divinity School, so I teach medicine and spirituality. I'll get back tomorrow because I have my medicine and spirituality and healing course for Harvard Divinity students, Harvard Medical students, and Harvard School of Public Health students. And so it's just a wonderful, fertile field for these students to come together before they get too indoctrinated in the hierarchy, and to be in conversation around this issue of this intersection of medicine and spirituality. And again, like Ray has said, I have found that people are so much more open to hearing about it. It's often us who sit on this. When I was a second-year resident, I was particularly, I had come in and recognized that by the time in medical school, you just check all that spiritual stuff at the door, and let's stick with the facts. Let's do the science. And so certainly I remember when I was in my first week of residency, I wrote something in the chart about a family wanting to be prayed for, and indicating that was a good thing, and having the attending kind of tap me on the shoulder and said that's not appropriate to be in the chart. So I again learned early on, let's not talk about that stuff. One of my patients was a little girl named Elizabeth who was 5 years old and developed a kind of leukemia, which at the time we could not cure. Now we could easily do this, but at the time it was a kind of leukemia for which there was no cure. But the medicines were so toxic. It was in the early days when we were really, in many ways, experimenting with some of the medications that are so familiar now in the treatment of cancer, and we would often say that the treatment was really worse than the disease itself. And so Elizabeth was coming down. She lived way up in Maine, where it's way colder than it is here, and would come down for treatments. And again, she was 5 at the time, and we were rounding, and the mother greeted us in the morning on rounds to say that they wanted to stop the treatments, and they just really wanted to go home to Maine and live out their lives. For whatever they had. And she was actually asking us, in a way, asking for permission. Well, now, one of the advances is that we know that we very much engage families in these conversations and shared decision-making. But really back then, if this mother had taken that child, we could have filed an abuse report on her, and that would have been very difficult. And what was amazing was that my attending agreed to let them go. And the mother continued. One of the real drivers for his decision was the mother said that she wrestled all night long trying to figure out whether that was a good thing to just pull Elizabeth out of treatment. And in the morning, Elizabeth woke up and said, "Mommy, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go home." And so with that in mind, they went off, and I didn't know whether I would see them again, but several months later, at the end of the day, when I was making my evening rounds, I was going down the hall and heard singing coming from one of the rooms, which was kind of unusual on the oncology floor. And when I looked in, there was Elizabeth. She had on a party hat, and there were balloons, and the nurses and her mom was there, and there was a cake, so I assumed it was a birthday. And she explained to me that actually it was not her birthday. The reason that they were having a party was because she said she had been praying. And she asked me if I knew what prayer was. And she explained that praying is when you talk to God, and God talks back to you. And God had told her 3 things. She was going to go to heaven, she was going to see her grandmother, and she wasn't going to be sick anymore. That's our gospel. And so I put on a hat, and I joined the party. I did not see Elizabeth anymore, but several months after that, her mom paged me to the lobby, and when I went down, she explained that Elizabeth had died, and she had a black Raggedy Ann doll with her. And she said that when Elizabeth went back, so first of all, which I didn't know this, so again, they lived way up in Maine, and that I was the first black person Elizabeth ever met. And I was their doctor. And so they found this black Raggedy Ann doll. This was about 45 years ago. I'm sure it was the only black Raggedy Ann doll in the state of Maine. And she named her Dr. Gloria and made out a will. Now, by now she's 6. She made out a will, and she was willing Dr. Gloria to me. So I still have Dr. Gloria, and she's in my office on the 3rd floor of our house. And Dr. Gloria reminds me of a couple of things. One is be open to really ministering people where they are. I had never spoken to her about God. Again, I'd already been cautioned, don't do that. But she was there. I don't even know whether they were Christians, but she was there. And she also teaches me the difference between healing and curing. What we know as physicians is that, honestly, there are not a lot of times we can cure people. We certainly can't do it all the time. We can comfort all the time. But there is a healing that transcends my situation, so that I have a faith in someone higher than me to see me through. And I also do some, as Ray has said, some work in terms of end-of-life care, palliative care. And I've come to recognize that God promises healing, but it's not necessarily physical healing. And as I say to people all the time, I mean, we can believe God for a miracle, and there's certainly, the Bible is replete with miracles that Jesus did in his time. But 2,000 years later, none of those people are here today. I kind of think if they were, I bet Dr. Phil would have had them on the show. Oprah would have given them a car or something. So God calls people home. And Elizabeth said that it was a good thing. And I've come to expect that as we transition to that end of life, people may not be cured, but God is working healing in all kinds of places. And that's the power of the gospel that we have, is to be agents that God can use to affect healing. So yeah, we're doctors, but we're ministers, and we're ministers of healing. And I believe that all of us can be ministers of healing as well. So lessons learned along the way. Questions?
No, you need to stand up here. They're asking questions of you, not me.
Okay.
and if you could take the questions from up there, that'd be great. Okay.
Oh, for a moment. Come on, Ray. Let's do this together. Okay.
Okay, questions for Reverend Dr. Gloria. I have a question. I do.
Okay.
First of all, thank you so much, both of you, for your love and for your grace. And sexual violence is a very significant issue, as well as domestic violence. How have you counseled men who have experienced sexual violence? Because that's a very dark thing for most men. Believe it or not, and at least in my experience as a pastor, they're not even as open about that area. How have you or either of you dealt with that area?
Honey? Yeah, I would say, and again, especially with, since we've been doing this work, we have encountered more and more men who've been victims of sexual assault. And I absolutely agree with you that that is particularly shameful for men. But in many ways, it requires some of the same kind of space, is really giving, is listening, believing them. I'm so sorry that you experienced this. So we're not the court of law, so we're not trying to figure out, well, who said what or whatever, but I'm listening intently and I'm believing. I'm respecting your choices. So I'm not trying to steer you a particular way, but I'm really there to respect your choices. I'm educating myself. We're looking for resources, so we've over the years identified some wonderful resources for men who've been victims of sexual violence, and I'm taking care of myself because it's this work is. I am firmly persuaded that this is the enemy's playground. And this is from the very beginning, this is such a stronghold, and particularly in our culture now, that the enemy does not sit by quietly and allow us to intercede. And so it's also important for yourself to do your own self-care. And again, to be in a community of people of like-minded faith, or just whether they share your faith or whether they're doing this because they understand your plight, and to get that kind of support. So we, again, as we have spoken it, more men have come. And I would say really the blessing with Me Too is that I have heard so many people have come to us and disclose this is the first time. And we're also able to provide some support. So much of our work now is as you've seen with Shatter the Silence, is we started out primarily addressing the issue among women, but this is a problem. This is us. This is our problem. So we are all hands on deck.
Thank you. Questions? Okay, we have one over here, and then we'll get one back there. If you wouldn't mind standing and also giving us your name, please.
My name is Janice Kelly, and my question for you, I would be interested in hearing a bit about your ministry to the victimizers, and I'm thinking especially the numbers aren't real good as far as pedophiles and all even admitting what they've done.
Yeah. So this one I am going to have Ray do, because he's actually, we've done some work.
Thank you.
Without any pretense to expertise, as we've talked more about it, we have found more people who've been willing to acknowledge it, and some who've come in the context of the legal issues that they've encountered. Our assistant pastor is a former probation officer, and because of that, still gets referrals from the legal system. So we've had a couple of instances in which people have literally sought a church community as a registered sexual offender who's acknowledged, in some cases served their sentence. And we've learned that you have to put in some very serious protocols. You've got to have people who are willing to work along with folks. You certainly got to know that you're dealing with somebody who's taken responsibility and is getting the other sort of ancillary supports and treatments that they need. That's been one aspect of what we've done. The other piece of this has been the person who's been able to finally acknowledge both their role as victim and perpetrator. So as perpetrator, they're sort of reproducing what they have been through themselves, and that's often particularly true when that abuse has started very, very young. So again, getting people into the treatment, being sure that they're continuing to do the work that they need to do, and really putting both support and accountability group around them. as I said, in many ways, this is for us just beginning and still have a lot to learn here. But I think it's an important area. And again, as I say, it's something I think the church can really play a tremendous role. But it requires a major commitment in the context of people doing this. You can't do this as an individual. You really have to have a group of people, a body of people who will be a part of it.
I'd say one of the other things that we are just starting to talk about is the extent to which pornography is a huge driver of sexual violence. And as you can imagine, we also do a lot of work with couples. And the pornography is the ghost in the bedroom. It's so prevalent. So we have also just started to talk about it. Our youth pastor and one of his more recent sermons talked about pornography and said that afterwards he was amazed at how many men pulled him aside and said, we need to talk about this. So these are opportunities every time someone comes. And the other thing I think is important for you understanding, when we're presenting this work, it sounds like, oh my gosh, we have this mega machine. And I mean, we've certainly, we've built something so that people will come. And when people have giftings outside, so one of the people who was deeply involved with this is a psychologist whose real work is with sexual trauma. She said she never thought she would be able to do this in a church. But you often have people in your community who are just waiting for someone to say, we can talk about that here. And for this work, it's important to do it in community. It's great to have a community in your congregation, but if not, create a community of, again, people who may share your faith, but people who get the vision that this is something that needs to be addressed.
My name's Ashley Smith, and my question is, how do you minister to children, like in a hospital setting? I know we have to do CPE, and I'm a little about doing that in hospitals because I teach children. So it's like, how are you able to minister without technically ministering to children in their final days and their families?
You know, it's really interesting. I would say that oftentimes the children are actually the easiest. I mean, in the sense that I've had children tell me, I know I'm going to die, but I can't say anything to my parents because they don't want to hear that. And so part of the opportunity, if you will, is is not to say to the kid, oh, no, don't, it's like, you tell me more. And then to begin, the real work, like I said, and understandably is really supporting parents to work through this reality. And again, in our work as both pastors and physicians, I try to stay, depending on which of our I try to stay in the pastor role and to support the physicians where really as much as I can, but I do try to be there. They'll have other physicians, but I'm there as a pastor, so I try to stay in that role when we have congregants who are in the hospital. But anyway, you're doing CPE, so you've got your CPE director who will coach you through that, and it's wonderful. If you can support kids, you can certainly support grown-ups. I mean, grown-ups like them, right? But if you know how to work and support kids and families, you've got adults.
We have time for maybe one more question. Yes.
Good evening. I'm Deborah Penny. The question that I have, perhaps for the both of you, as you talk about the concept, not me too, but we too. So how do you educate? What are the ways that you educate your church to be a part of this we too? What are the strategies you use? Because I can imagine if all of a sudden you're telling your church we're moving in this direction and we're becoming a part of a we too, some must feel like they can't do this work and they leave. So what are the ways that you bring the church along as well.
Sure. So again, we often in churches, let me say, I know Black church, the pulpit, a lot really moves by way of the pulpit. So we teach about these things and we preach about these things. And nowadays there's like lots of really great material and other people who are involved in this work who can support you with regard to that. And again, we name that. We engage people in terms of advocacy and marches and whatever, emails and et cetera, so that people understand that. And we look at the numbers. And as people start to talk, we realize, again, 1 out of 3. I haven't seen any good data on in the church, but I honestly suspect that the numbers might be even higher in the church because it selects for people who need to be in a healing community, and the church can provide that for them. So once people start to know, once you just put it out there, so many of us have been affected. When I ask people to raise your hand, if you've either been someone or you know someone, there's not a hand that doesn't go up. We know these people, and in many cases, they are us.
Dr. Paul, do we have any online questions?
Can I just throw one other thing very quickly? We also know that we kind of select, being the founders of the church, for people who don't mind dealing with these sort of out there issues. It's a tougher job when you're coming to a church that's been established, but there are a couple of things that I've learned that are really interesting. With the work with 10 Point, and I think to some extent this was true for some of the engagement with people around Shadow of the Silence, that to the extent that it becomes not just the pastor's project, but something that really touches the congregation. And that can occur in several ways. In the case of 10 Point, for example, one of our co-founding pastors was pastor of a congregation was 150 years old. And the first couple of years, he got a lot of resistance because people resented this time and attention that was being given to all these kids who never came to church, whose parents didn't put a dime in the offering, and who were keeping the pastor from visiting me on my first day in the hospital. He only showed up the second or third day. So what he began to appreciate, the turnaround in the congregation came when he began working with the grandchildren of the members. Then they got it. And what we will often say to people is, you will have to pray for and look for an organic connection between that congregation that they don't even know is there. And so whether it's the deeply revered member who stands up and says, this issue of sexual violence is real in my family. Let me tell you my story. So that it's not just the pastor's idea, it really is something that people see touching them no matter how long they've been around, however traditional they might be. It comes home and it becomes alive.
Can we give the Hammonds a wonderful round of applause? Thank you so very much. Dr. Ra is going to come and say some closing words. Thank you all so much for coming. I know this has been a blessing for me, and I hope it's been a blessing for you.
Ray and Gloria, thank you again. Thank you for blessing our community, for being here with us. I'm going to close this in prayer and send us forth. Gracious God, we are thankful for the ministry of Ray and Gloria Hammond, thankful for the many, many lives they've touched, the transformation that has occurred not only in their community, in the church, but in the entire city of Boston, and certainly even nationally and internationally, the lives they have touched. So we as a community here at North Park pray a grateful, thankful blessing to our mentors and leaders and pastors who were able to speak to us tonight. We pray for a blessing upon their household, for their children, for their grandchildren, the work that you're doing, not only through them, but through their family, through their church, and through the community that they fostered all over the world. So we thank you that we've gotten a small glimpse and a small part of that work, And we pray for your blessing to continue to work through them. You've began a good work in them, and we know that you will continue to prosper through them and work through them. We as a community say these things in your precious name. Let the church say, amen.